point of studying international relations is to study how other countries interact with each other, right? The previous lecture focused on how decisions are made, how policy or how foreign policy is formulated, how it's implemented, and it's how it's evaluated, right? And a big chunk of that lecture focused on the conditions that affect the kinds of decisions that individual countries make when they deal with other countries, correct? Okay? Now, this chapter introduces this whole concept of relationship, where two countries interact with each other. More than two countries interact with each other in a way where they actually agree to kind of work in tandem, to work in unison in dealing with a situation. Because some challenges that countries face cannot be solved individually. Think about the environment, for example. You know, you can have pretty much most of the countries trying to adhere to these new environmental anti-pollution laws, but all it takes is the United States and China, where you have the most amount of productivity taking place, to not to adhere to those. So what happens? The whole concept really becomes kind of meaningless, right? Not meaningless, I should say. It becomes relatively complicated because the major polluters, and it's important when we say major polluters, it's not because the United States is choosing to pollute, but when we do the chapter on the environment, the whole environmental debate rests on what? Man versus nature, right? And man using nature to do what? To survive, to produce goods, to produce services. And when man uses nature to produce goods and services, he generates what? Pollution. And what are you going to do about that pollution? And not only does he generate pollution, he also, when I say maybe, I mean in the generalist sense, whenever you're essentially utilizing or producing goods and services, you have to generate energy, right? And that energy has a consequence. It warms the earth, right? Now we'll talk about that in greater detail when we go over that chapter. But the point is that if we're going to somehow solve these problems, there are certain situations that require what? Some sort of agreements amongst countries. And that's really what this chapter is all about, okay? And it's not just about security, because really the major chunk here in this chapter talks about the whole issue of security. And that's typically the first example of why countries decide to enter into these alliances, okay? And typically alliances would be when you have two or more, okay? Multilateral would be more than two, bilateral would be two, unilateral would be one. Okay, that's important, not just for the exam, not just in terms of this course, but also for the simulation that you're going to be doing. The thing about alliances is that, as I said, you know, two countries or two or more countries get together in order to solve the problem that they cannot individually solve. Okay? So they've agreed that there are certain situations that they would be better off, okay, if they work together. And the first class example would be security. Now think about this. Imagine, you know, you watch one of these old movies. Who saw Rob Roy? Everybody see Rob Roy? What was the last military movie? Anybody ever? What was the last? Okay, Braveheart. Did you ladies see Braveheart? Yeah. Everybody saw Braveheart, right? Who didn't see Braveheart? I'm sorry, I'm not. Come on. Does everybody here saw it? Okay. So what was the whole point about Braveheart? That you had, apart from the, you know, you had different lords or different landowners, right? And going to war and trying, but each of these landlords were meeting to do what? Together to do what? To work against, or to kind of enter into these alliances so they could collectively fight against the King of England, right? And when you think about it, you know, 1,000 years back in time, you got two tribes living next to each other, right? And all these crazy people on horses come in from the north or south, east or west, and they attack the villages, right? So next time, what are these villages going to do? They're going to enter into some sort of alliance in order to protect themselves from these crazy, wild individuals coming from whatever part of land they're coming from, okay? So typically, when you have two groups working together, that increases the defense capabilities of a particular group of countries. Another thing about alliances, which is important here, typically, and although this is actually very interesting because the underlying assumption here is allies don't ally with enemies, and that's very, very important.
Allies don't what, sorry?
Allies don't ally with enemies. In other words, you don't enter into agreement with your enemies, and that's a little bit of a, that's a little touchy here, right? Because that's very, 20th century like. Because the bottom line is that you ally with other individuals if it's in your self-interest. So the question now becomes, what do you mean by the term enemy? And that's something I want you to keep in mind. Because, Winston Churchill has this famous quote where he says, "I'll go to dinner with the devil, but I will sip my soup with a long spoon." Right? Meaning, the devil being the enemy, and meaning that whatever it takes to solve the problem, even if it means going to dinner with your enemy. Now, alliances have had both their critics and supporters, okay? Realists, for example, have suggested that whenever you begin to enter into alliance, 2-3 countries together become more powerful. And from a realist point of view, whenever a group becomes more powerful, what does that do? There's a zero-sum game, right? More power here means less power somewhere else. And whenever you are more powerful, you then become a little more confident. And if you become a little more confident, then that basically suggests that you're more likely to use that power against another country. Now, if a group of countries are entering into these alliances, what's going to happen to the enemy? The enemy now is going to do what? Enter into their own alliances, right? Kind of like what was happening during the Cold War period. You had countries who were allying with the United States and countries who were allying with the Soviet Union. Okay, Soviet Union, that entity that had 15 republics, which was destroyed before or fell apart before you guys were born. I find that very fascinating. That everybody in here was born typically after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what happens is that when you have alliances, counter-alliances, those individuals who don't want to participate in this kind of game are kind of forced to take a side. They're forced to choose, right? Because if they don't, then they become kind of like stuck out there on their own, and they're essentially, in a way, very vulnerable. Now, there are some countries that have been able to kind of stay neutral, like Switzerland, for example. But then again, who's been in Switzerland? I mean, that's a very difficult place to go to, isn't it?